Hello, my name is Renee Lindsay, and today I will be presenting on human performance technology and educational technology in online education. Specifically, I will be examining how human performance technology can be used to assess educational technology as a means to improve student engagement in the online classroom. It is important to understand what human performance technology is before discussing how it can be a useful tool for educational institutions. As an interdisciplinary resource, it is difficult to fully define human performance technology, or HPT, but the most basic understanding is that human performance technology is a systematic process that uses analysis to study and understand human performance and to test and implement measures to mitigate performance gaps. So basically, what HPT was designed to do was to fully understand human performance in an organization. So, if an organization has a workforce that is performing well, HPT could be used to analyze why that workforce is performing well. That way, the organization will know and will know how to continue to encourage their workforce to perform at the best that they can. Now, the counterpoint is also true in this situation that if that workforce in that organization is underperforming, human performance technology can be employed to understand what might be the cause for why that workforce is underperforming. So are they underperforming due to a high workload or stress in their home life or low pay or anything like that? So, human performance technology can be utilized to find these performance gaps, analyze what is causing them, and implement ways to fix these potential causes. But how does this understanding fit with education? HPT was originally designed to analyze performance in business or industry setting, but these practitioners observed practical application for education. So many educational institutions utilize instructional design models rather than human performance technology models. And the difference between the two is that instructional design models focus on the instruction, which is what a lot of educational institutions focus on. They focus on the instruction, what they're teaching, and how they're delivering it to their students, how they're delivering instruction to the faculty, to the staff, in order to make sure that they have all of the equipment they need. But human performance technology looks at more than just instruction. So if there are potential problems with the materials that are being used, such as students at home not having access to the internet, not having technology available to them, or perhaps they are dealing with issues at the school itself, such as perhaps one classroom is located next to band and the students are having difficulty focusing on their material with the band practicing very loudly. So human performance technology is able to analyze all of these different factors in order to find causes for performance gaps in this educational institution, in order to find ways to avoid these gaps, to be able to encourage students and faculty and school administrators to perform to their best ability. The way human performance technology works is best demonstrated through this model. The first part of the human performance technology process is the organizational analysis, or the analysis of the subject itself. And from there, the practitioner can go towards the environmental analysis, which is the analysis of the environment of the organization, and then to the actual state of the workforce performance. And then from the beginning part of the organizational analysis, the practitioner can go to the desired workforce performance, so the desired human performance. So if the actual human performance does not line up with the desired human performance, between those two subjects is the gap analysis. So if there is a gap, or if the actual human performance does not line up with the desired one, or does not exceed the desired element, then what is causing this particular gap? So there is a gap present. And so from that gap analysis, the practitioner then goes to the cause analysis. So when a performance gap has been identified, the potential causes will be analyzed using the information collected through the front-end analysis at the beginning of the process. So the organizational analysis and the environmental analysis are very key and must be done very thoroughly in order to best provide information for the cause analysis. So how can this be applied in an educational setting? If a teacher, for instance, notices that a performance gap exists in their classroom, say that the students are not performing well in the time period just before lunch, then the teacher can employ human performance technology in order to isolate this performance gap and identify potential causes. So the teacher can use organizational and environmental analysis to analyze the entirety of their classroom structure, everything from the lesson plans to the classroom setup and what students are positioned where, etc. And then position the desired workforce performance or the desired student performance and the actual student performance and isolate this particular gap or the students not performing well in the time period just before lunch. Once this gap has been isolated, the teacher can then apply the cause analysis. So, what is causing this potential performance gap? And then use the information collected about the classroom setting. So, is this gap could be caused by the students are hungry just before lunch and so they are distracted and wanting to eat or be with their friends, or perhaps the instruction is not as interesting just before lunch and so they are not engaged with the material. So once these potential causes have been identified, the teacher can then implement strategies and tools in order to hopefully prevent these causes from creating even more disruptance or even more performance gaps for the students. So, a strategy that could mitigate this particular performance gap could be something such as introducing a snack time into the time period of class or using more diversified learning strategies to make the material more interesting for the students. So, human performance technology does have applications in education, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll be looking at how this model can be applied to analyze educational technology and how it can be used to impact student engagement in the online classroom. For this project, the definition of educational technology refers to resources, strategies, or tools used for learning in any type of educational setting. Now, this educational setting can refer to anything from the traditional classroom at an educational institution to the hybrid or online classroom, or even outside of educational institutions at community centers for recreational learning, or in businesses and industries where education and training take place to train the workforce to do a particular task. Primarily, when people hear the term educational technology, they imagine a classroom full of students on their laptops or giant robotics labs with complex technologies involved in education. But truthfully, the resources for learning can refer to anything from pencil and paper to projectors and computers, or even the modern learning strategies such as project-based learning and game-based learning that educators use to make learning more dynamic. Dichner and Wagner indicate that the educational technology was steadily expanding through the 20th century, but grew rapidly with the introduction of online education. So online education really expanded kind of who could have education or who could access it, because it allowed for educational institutions to make their courses and course material available for students who could not necessarily receive them before, because it allowed for students who were geographically unable to reach an educational institution, who were too far away from a school to be able to continue their education, or students who had physical or difficulties with being in school building in person. It allowed for them to continue their education online. Or even for adult students who had jobs and families, online education allows for them to continue to learn on their own schedule. So online education really expanded how education worked. And so more and more schools started to adopt online education, and particularly the digital educational technologies that allowed online education to work. So in the last decade, it has greatly expanded. But due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this gradual expansion just continued, skyrocketed, because schools were not allowed to have in-person classes during the main part of the pandemic, or were forced to have remote learning through different time periods where students or faculty were exposed to the virus. So educational institutions had to rapidly adopt online education and educational technologies in order to continue to let students learn and help them to continue to learn during this particular time period. And so the educational technologies that they were adopting were techniques that they might not have used in the traditional classroom. And so faculty and staff who were in this educational environment were not familiar with how students would react to these particular technologies. So how could they understand what kind of impact these technologies would have on student engagement in the online classroom? So why is student engagement in online education so important? And how does human performance technology help us to understand student engagement? Performance and engagement are linked. If a student is not engaged with the learning process and is not engaged with the educational materials and the resources and the technologies available to them, then the student will not be performing at their best efficiency. They will not be learning at their best efficiency. And if the student is not performing well, then the faculty and staff, who are also part of the educational process, the online educational process, they will not be performing well because their role is to facilitate learning. And if the student is not engaged, if the student is not learning, then they are not performing at their peak efficiency. And so this indicates a performance gap. And human performance technology is designed to detect performance gaps and to implement measures to prevent the cause of the performance gap. Now, it is easier to measure student engagement in a classroom with an in-person component, such as a traditional seated classroom or the hybrid or flipped classrooms. But the online classroom provides an unique and interesting difficulty for educators because they are separate from the students. Now, the main learning theories that are involved with the educational process, they really stress the importance of student engagement in any type of learning environment. The constructivist learning theory, for example, is one of the main learning theories that is used in modern education. And this theory places the importance of the learner constructing new knowledge from knowledge previously acquired. So as the learner basically makes pieces of knowledge in their mind and sends it to permanent memory or long-term memory, and then new information is gained, they can piece that information on knowledge that is already put together, such as constructing with building blocks or Legos. As people piece the Legos together, they create something new and can remove pieces and put them in new places. And so the constructivist learning theory is all about learners engaging with the material to actively participate in the learning process. So engagement is key in this learning theory. Now, the second learning theory, which is a very important learning theory for not just traditional educational settings, but for online education, is the self-directed learning theory. Online education is very self-directed. It involves the individual taking charge of their own education and pursuing their own learning and basically learning for themselves. So because the instructor is separate from the student is responsible for their own learning and is responsible for constructing their own knowledge and basically participating in the constructivist process. But the online classroom relies on students engaging with the material. And if students are not engaging with material, then the instructor has to figure out why, and has to figure out ways in order to encourage engagement or improve engagement. And one particular way is the use of educational technology. So how can educational technologies really encourage students to engage with the material in the classroom and encourage them to continue to perform well or exceed performance and exceed learning to enjoy the process? One educational technology resource that can be employed in online education to encourage student engagement is the use of dynamic learning strategies. Dynamic learning strategies are part of the previously discussed constructivist learning theory, as well as self-directed learning theory, and are employed to actively engage students with the learning process to maximize performance in the classroom, whether that classroom is in the face-to-face classroom or specifically in this instance, the online classroom. So, popular learning strategies include, but are not limited to, game-based learning, where students engage in a game in order to acquire knowledge; inquiry-based learning, where students posit questions and theorize in order to connect information with real-world application; and finally, project-based learning, where students actively complete a project with each other or by themselves to facilitate learning. But how does human performance technology work with these learning strategies, with this educational technological resource, as a way to understand if this resource does actually encourage engagement with the material and improve performance in the overall classroom? So, human performance technology practitioners or instructors have previously used these learning strategies in the actual human performance technology classroom. So, teachers who are responsible for training people in how to use human performance technology utilize these strategies in the classroom as a way to demonstrate how effective they are for the learning process. So, a previous study by Lachamou et al. Indicated that project-based learning was particularly effective in the human performance technology classroom. Students were given a project and were encouraged to work together to come up with a solution or end result for this particular project. So this demonstrated to both the instructor and the students how useful human performance technology was when connection with these particular learning strategies. So they were able to apply human performance technology to this particular problem and this particular project, but they were also able to see how this project was able to encourage student engagement with the classroom material and improve performance, thereby also demonstrating how human performance technology could measure student engagement through these dynamic learning strategies. So, as the students learn to use this project-based learning and these dynamic learning strategies, they are able to utilize this information and apply it to a future situation where they could employ dynamic learning strategy in the online classroom to encourage student engagement. Other educational technologies that follow the same theme of allowing students to work together to improve engagement and performance are virtual communities and communication apps. Virtual communities, or virtual communities of practice, are considered to be part of the human performance technology model. They are utilized particularly in businesses and industries that have high innovation or creative section. Coworkers are encouraged to stay in contact with each other through this online platform to continue to debate ideas and theorize innovations. But these communities, although they're utilized primarily in businesses, they have applications for educational institutions as well. They would allow for students to remain in contact with each other for group work or particularly project-based learning in order to continue to engage and interact with each other and with the material. This would then encourage a performance improvement in the online educational classroom. Now, other types of communities which are less innovative and creative based are typically communication apps themselves, such as social media apps, or just general chat rooms. So these communication apps allow for students to connect and talk with each other, sometimes without the teacher present, and other times with the teacher to observe and to moderate the discussion. So these communication apps allow for community to thrive and to grow in the online classroom. And typically, the community aspect is one of the hardest things to foster in the online education because students are separate from each other. So as students are separate from each other and separate from the instructor, they no longer build up that feeling of camaraderie that is often accompanied by being in person in the in-person classroom. So the online classroom really relies on students kind of communicating and talking with each other in order to engage with the material. If students are having difficulty with the material, then they will communicate with each other in order to process this difficulty. The study that Wu et al. Completed was a study about the use of communication apps, particularly in English as a foreign language students. And so these students, as they were learning this foreign language, English, they were working together to kind of improve each other's language. And so they would work as more of like a peer study rather than having the pressure from the instructor critiquing and correcting their language each time. So this allowed for the students to really enhance their engagement with the subject because they could work and learn from each other. And so through this, their performance would also increase because it was really student learning rather than a student learning from the teacher or student learning just from the material. So human performance technology can be implemented in the online education classroom to analyze these virtual communities and these communication apps to see if they actually do improve engagement and therefore improve performance for students in the online educational classroom. Human performance technology is meant to locate performance gaps and test methods to alleviate these gaps. But in some cases, in educational institutions, the educational process itself hinders student engagement and performance. Just as educational technology can encourage and promote student engagement in the classroom, it can hinder engagement as well. One of the main problems facing educational technology and online education on a global scale is the digital divide. The digital divide refers to the space between those who have access to digital technology and those who do not have access to these same technologies. There are typically two reasons for this digital divide. The first one being a lack of financial ability to be able to afford technologies. Now, this lack of money, this lack of financial security and stability can refer to the students themselves and their families, where they're not able to afford technologies for in their homes. So in case you have a family of like 5 or 6 children all in school and maybe only one computer, and so they have to pick and choose who has access to the computer. So this would tend to disrupt engagement in online education and would disrupt engagement with the educational process, and so would limit student performance. Now, other times this financial limitations could refer to the school itself. So Scrum and Summerfield indicated that many schools in recent years have taken to purchasing laptops and tablets for students to be able to borrow and to use at home in order to complete their homework and participate with online education in the online classroom platform. But schools aren't always able to afford these resources and these technologies, and so this often hinders the performance of the school in general and hinders their online education adoption, and so would limit the performance and engagements of students who would need that online platform but cannot participate because they do not have access to resources to allow them to continue their education online. Now, the second issue is a geographical issue. Now, in some cases, geography limits where technologies can go, such as internet lines. And so internet internet companies rely on particular technologies in order to reach certain areas, but some areas cannot have access to this technology. And so students who live in these areas do not have access to complete online education in their homes. And so therefore they would have to travel to a location where internet is provided. And this can cause feelings of frustration in the students, and so they would be less likely to want to engage with the online classroom and the online material. Now, human performance technology can evaluate for these potential performance gaps. In 2018, Nwulu completed a dissertation project in Nigeria in Nigerian universities on distance education in these universities, and found that the lack of educational technology hindered the growth of online education in these universities, and online education would have greatly expanded their distance learning reach. And so theorized that by furthering educational technology and increasing access to the technologies would have expanded online education and would have greatly encouraged engagement and performance for the students. So this is what human performance technology can do. It can locate these performance gaps with educational technology and understand why these technologies might cause hindrance to student engagement and student performance in the classroom, and can work as a way to attempt to find a preventative measure to prevent this gap from continuing to be a problem. As technology continues to advance, educators must look to the future of educational technology and what types of technologies could be employed to be used in online education. One avenue for evaluation is to examine what technologies businesses are using for training and education, and what human performance technology reports are being written about these technologies. Despite the obvious use of HPT in education, educational institutions have been reluctant to adopt human performance technology as an educational resource. HPT has been used to test the efficacy of advanced technologies such as augmented reality, which is where a program typically on a mobile device such as a tablet or a phone are used on top of real-world situations, and virtual reality, which is a completely separate virtual reality on the online platform. And these have been used as training tools in the workplace. These studies that HPT practitioners have used in businesses can be adapted and built on to use as a basis for how to adapt these technologies for an educational setting. These technologies are technologies that could be in practice in educational institutions in the next few years, since many higher educational institutions around the world are already testing the feasibility of incorporating augmented reality and virtual reality as part of education, primarily in online education. These technologies would be able to introduce curriculum and learning and communities for students beyond what contemporary technologies can already do. So human performance technology should be brought in to evaluate if these technologies can be useful in education, and if they can help to encourage student engagement with educational material and continue to build on student performance in the online classroom. Student engagement is a key part of education, because if students are not engaged with the learning process, then they are not performing at their best as students. And if students are not performing, then the faculty and staff and everyone involved with the educational institution are not performing at their best ability. Human performance technology can help to alleviate many of these burdens and help to evaluate why students are not engaging with the material, because human performance technology can be used to locate performance gaps at educational institutions at any level of the institution, whether they are instructional gaps within one classroom, with an overall subject or grade level, or potential gaps that might be outside of the educational institution's control, such as gaps within the environment around the school, but that the educational institution and the administrator still should be aware of and know in order to find a way to mitigate these potential performance gaps. Human performance technology can also be useful in evaluating the usefulness of educational technology and what types of technologies schools would like to incorporate, particularly when dealing with online education. Online education is going to continue to expand within the next couple years and over the next decade and coming years, because it is an extremely effective and also extremely convenient way to connect with the students in their home environments, but also to keep learning outside of school and outside the typical environment where some students might struggle to learn in the traditional face-to-face classroom. So human performance technology can help to evaluate the online educational platform as a way to locate any potential performance gaps on the platform itself, but also the resources and materials that are used for educational technology and for online education in order to make sure that students continue to have the best education possible. It was very interesting to learn about human performance technology and what it has to offer to educational institutions. And these studies utilized for this paper as research are very informative for educational institutions to look at as well as to learn from in order to understand what educational technologies have to offer for online education, but also how human performance technology can be used to evaluate these technologies as a means to improve student performance in the online classroom. Thank you for your attention through this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed the information about human performance technology in online education.